What if the son of a dictator was even more feared than the father himself? Have you ever wondered what went through the mind of Uday Saddam Hussein, the eldest son of Saddam Hussein, who lived in the shadow of power but cast his own darkness across Iraq? His name was whispered in terror, his cruelty unmatched, his life filled with excess and violence. But in the end, what became of him? Why did Uday Hussein, once destined to inherit a kingdom of fear, fall so tragically from grace? Uday Saddam Hussein was born on June 18, 1964, into a life of unimaginable privilege. As the eldest son of Saddam Hussein, he was treated not merely as a child, but as a prince of Iraq. He grew up in a world where power was absolute, wealth was limitless, and consequences seemed non-existent. Yet even in his youth, those around him sensed something dark within Uday's personality. He was impulsive, violent, and cruel. Teachers, servants, and even close family members feared his temper. Unlike his brother Qusay, who was quieter and more calculating, Uday wore his brutality openly. Saddam himself once admitted that Uday's temperament was dangerous, but as his firstborn, he could not ignore him. From the very beginning, Uday's path was shaped not by responsibility, but by excess and indulgence. As Uday grew older, his cruelty only intensified. He lived in his father's palaces, surrounded by luxury, but his pleasures were fueled by fear. Stories circulated of how Uday would take what he wanted, whether it was wealth, cars, or even women. He turned Baghdad into his hunting ground, and his reputation became one of terror. He was known for parties that ended in violence, for cruelty against athletes who underperformed, and for a temper that left even Saddam furious. One infamous incident shocked even the inner circle. During a party in 1988, Uday killed his father's trusted valet and food taster with a weapon in a drunken rage. That act nearly destroyed his relationship with Saddam, and for a time, Uday's position as heir seemed uncertain. Yet, despite his brutality, Uday remained untouchable. He was Saddam's son, and in Iraq, that meant no one could hold him accountable. Despite his reckless behavior, Uday was often positioned as Saddam's public face. He controlled portions of Iraq's media, particularly through the newspaper Babel and a television station, where propaganda praised the regime and glorified his father. But behind the facade, Uday used this power to feed his ego, silencing critics and punishing anyone who dared to question him. His lavish lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the suffering of ordinary Iraqis who lived under crushing sanctions and fear. While the people struggled to survive, Uday flaunted gold-plated guns, luxury cars, and extravagant palaces. He saw himself as untouchable, destined to inherit his father's empire. But even among Saddam's allies, whispers began to grow. Was Uday truly fit to rule? In 1996, Uday's reign of terror nearly came to an end. While driving through Baghdad, he was ambushed by gunmen and struck with more than a dozen bullets. He survived, but the attack left him permanently disabled. His spine was shattered, his walking impaired, and his once towering presence diminished. From that day, Uday's physical weakness contrasted sharply with his desire for control. He became more paranoid, more bitter, and even more violent. To compensate for his injuries, he lashed out at those around him. Yet, ironically, this attack exposed Uday's vulnerability. Iraqis who once feared him began to see a man who could bleed, a man who was not invincible. For the first time, cracks appeared in the armor of Saddam's eldest son. After the attack, Uday continued to indulge in luxury, but the world was changing around him. International sanctions tightened, Iraq's economy crumbled, and resentment against Saddam's family grew deeper. Uday remained a symbol of excess at a time when most Iraqis faced hunger and despair. His palaces were filled with stolen wealth, exotic animals, and extravagant cars, even as his people starved. His brutality against athletes, students, and even political allies became legendary. For Uday, cruelty was not just a tool, it was a way of life. But what he did not know was that his kingdom of fear was slowly collapsing. Forces far greater than himself were beginning to set their sights on Iraq. By the early 2000s, Iraq was already crippled under the weight of international sanctions. The nation was struggling, its people impoverished, yet Saddam Hussein and his family still held on to their palaces, their luxuries, and their unchecked power. Everything changed after the September 11th attacks in 2001. The United States, under President George W. Bush, redirected its foreign policy, targeting nations it labeled as the axis of evil. Iraq was suddenly at the center of global suspicion. Washington accused Saddam of developing weapons of mass destruction and of fostering ties to terrorist groups, allegations that continue to stir debate even today. Inside the American government, key figures like Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld argued that Saddam's Iraq posed a grave threat to the world. They pushed for decisive action. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair stood alongside them, strengthening the coalition's resolve. By early 2003, the decision had been made. The US and its allies would invade Iraq. For Saddam, Uday, and Qusay, this was the turning point. The walls of power they had built over decades were about to collapse. The invasion would not only challenge Saddam's rule, it would bring his sons, men feared across Iraq, face to face with their own mortality. In March 2003, US and coalition forces invaded Iraq. The assault was swift and devastating, and within weeks, Baghdad fell. Saddam Hussein vanished into hiding, moving between safe houses and underground bunkers, desperately trying to evade capture. But for Uday, life became a nightmare. Once surrounded by power and luxury, he was now hunted by the world's most powerful army. The palaces he had filled with treasures were raided, his weapons seized, and his secrets exposed. US forces discovered shocking evidence of his excess: golden rifles, torture chambers, and documents detailing the lives he had destroyed. The man who once ruled with terror now lived in fear. On July 22, 2003, US forces finally cornered Uday and his brother Qusay in the city of Mosul. Surrounded in a villa, the brothers refused to surrender. A fierce 4-hour gun battle erupted, involving rockets, heavy machine guns, and infantry assaults. When the smoke cleared, both Uday and Qusay were dead. The images of their lifeless bodies were broadcast worldwide, a symbolic end to the dynasty Saddam had built. For many Iraqis, their deaths marked the fall of a nightmare. For others, it was the end of an era that had defined Iraq for decades. The death of Uday Saddam Hussein was more than just the fall of a dictator's son. It was the collapse of a future that once seemed inevitable. Uday had been groomed to inherit Saddam's rule, but his own brutality, arrogance, and excess destroyed any chance of that dream. His reign left behind scars on athletes tortured under his orders, on women who lived in fear of being taken, and on an entire nation traumatized by his cruelty. Even after his death, the legacy of Uday Hussein serves as a reminder of unchecked power. He lived as a prince of terror, but he died in the dust of Mosul, hunted, broken, and despised. For the people of Iraq, his fall was both a relief and a warning that absolute power, when abused, will always lead to destruction. What if Uday Hussein had ruled Iraq after Saddam? Would the nation have suffered even greater horrors, or would history have taken a different path? We will never truly know. What we do know is that his life, marked by cruelty and fear, ended not as a king, but but as a fugitive. And that perhaps was the justice Iraqis had long been waiting for.